So, here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, lying there in the dark, you could almost certainly picture a pirate ship without even trying. A black hull, black sails, gliding out of the fog with a lantern swinging somewhere at the stern. Almost everyone alive can call up that image. It is one of the most recognizable ships in the whole world. And it never existed. It was never a real ship. There is no wreck of it on any seabed because there was never anything to sink. But here is the gentle part. Behind that imaginary ship, there is a whole world that was completely real. Real timber and rope. Real ships with real names, painted onto real sterns. Real people who lived and sailed and died out on the water 300 years ago, doing very nearly the things the films only pretend at. So that is what tonight is. We are going to take the ships you already know from the movies, one at a time, and we are going to walk each one slowly backward, out of the film and into the truth. The black ship, the fast little navy ship that chases it, the towering warship with all its guns, the pirate flagship with the frightening name, and the ghost ship that cannot come home. Every one of them points at something real, a real vessel, a real kind of ship, a real captain who actually lived. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that is completely fine. That is honestly the whole point of this. You do not need to follow every date. You do not need to hold on to a single name. None of this needs you awake to stay true. The ships will still be there in the morning, the real ones and the imaginary ones both. And so will you. So let's start where the story actually starts. Not with the films, not even with the ships, with the world that made all of it, a stretch of warm water and low green islands, a long time ago, when this was all really happening. The films give you a feeling more than a date. Powder smoke and sword fights, tricorn hats, gold in the hold, a governor in a wig. And that feeling is pointing at something specific. There was a real period with real edges that historians actually name. They call it the Golden Age of Piracy. It is a slightly romantic name for a fairly grim time, but it has stuck, and it is useful, so we will use it too. It ran, very roughly, from the 1650s to the 1730s. Less than 100 years, all told. A narrow window. Your own grandparents can remember further back than that whole age lasted, and yet almost every pirate you have ever heard of, real or invented, lived inside that one narrow window, in more or less the same warm corner of the world. So before we meet a single ship, let's spend a little while in that world, because the ships only make sense once you can see the water they floated on. It's worth pausing here before we go further, because the word pirate has to be pulled apart a little first. In the films, it means one thing, a kind of freedom, a black flag, a life outside the rules. In reality, it slid across a few different meanings, and the line between them was thin and often crossed. So let's take that slowly. The story really begins with the buccaneers. That is where the first stretch of the age sits, from around the 1650s to the 1680s. The word comes from a French word for a wooden frame used to smoke meat, of all things, because the earliest of these men were hunters and drifters living rough on the islands, grilling wild pig over slow fires. They were not born criminals. Many were runaways, castaways, deserters, and escaped servants, scraping a living on the edges of the Spanish Empire. And that empire was the whole point. In those years, Spain held the richest parts of the Americas, silver from the mountains of Peru and Mexico, gold, pearls, dyes, whole fleets of it, sailing home across the Atlantic every year. The other European powers, the English, the French, the Dutch, wanted a share and could not take it openly without a war. So they found a quieter way. They handed out letters. A letter of marque was a piece of paper from a government. It gave an ordinary sailor permission to attack the ships of an enemy nation and keep a cut of whatever he took. A man with that paper was called a privateer. On paper, he was legal. He was, in a sense, a private navy, doing a country's dirty work at no cost to the country. And when there was a war on, the paper was easy to get. So picture a hard, capable seaman in the Caribbean in those years. In wartime, with his letter of marque, he is a privateer, a patriot, a man the governor invites to dinner. He takes a Spanish ship, and half the port celebrates. And then the war ends. The paper stops meaning anything, but the man is still there. He still has his ship, his guns, his crew, and the only trade he has ever been good at. So he keeps doing exactly what he was doing last month. And what is he now? A patriot or a criminal? He has not changed at all. Only the paper has. And now, overnight, the same act has a different name. Now it is piracy, and now they can hang him for it. That is the machine that made most of these men. Not wickedness, exactly. War, and then the end of a war. And the buccaneer years had already produced one man whose whole life shows that machine turning, and his story is worth a moment because it ends somewhere you would never guess. His name was Henry Morgan. He was a Welshman, and he led the buccaneers of Jamaica in the 1660s and 70s with letters of marque in his pocket and a genius for the overland raid. He sacked rich Spanish towns along the coast, and in the year 1671, he did the most astonishing thing of his career. He led a small army of buccaneers across the jungle of the Isthmus and fell on Panama City, one of the wealthiest cities in all the Spanish Americas, and took it and burned it to the ground. It was a staggering, brutal feat. And what happened to him afterward? He was arrested and sent back to England in something like disgrace, because his raid had come at an awkward moment for the peace. And then the whole thing turned inside out. Instead of hanging, he was knighted. He came back to the Caribbean as Sir Henry Morgan, Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, and his new job was to hunt down the very pirates he had once led. He died in his bed, wealthy and respectable, in the year 1688. The greatest raider of his age, made a gentleman and a governor. It is the same pattern we keep meeting. The poacher made gamekeeper. Hornigold would do it. Woodes Rogers would do it. Morgan did it first and biggest. And the town Henry Morgan sailed from is one you already know, though you may not realize it, because the films use it. It was called Port Royal in Jamaica. In the first film, Port Royal is the neat, prim English colonial town with the stone fort on the hill, where the governor's daughter lives and the navy keeps its ships. In reality, Port Royal was very nearly the opposite of prim. It was the buccaneers' own city. It was packed with taverns and brothels and gold, one of the richest ports in the Americas, built almost entirely on plunder, and some called it the wickedest city on earth, and it came to an end worthy of any legend. On a morning in June, in the year 1692, a great earthquake struck, and much of Port Royal simply slid off the sand it was built on and sank straight into the sea, drowning thousands of people in a matter of minutes. A whole wicked city gone under the water in an afternoon. So the tidy colonial Port Royal you see on the screen is sitting, in a sense, right on top of a real drowned pirate city, whose streets and walls are still down there in the mud of the harbor. One more real thing the films quietly float above, which brings us to the last and most famous stretch of the age, and the one the films really live inside. It came right after a very large war, the one usually called the War of the Spanish Succession. It ended in the year 1713, and when it ended, it threw thousands of trained fighting sailors out of work all at once across the whole Atlantic world. Men who knew how to sail, how to fight, how to lay a gun, all suddenly with no war to fight and no wages coming in. A great many of them went on the account. That was the phrase they used for turning pirate, going on the account, as if it were simply a job you took, which, for a lot of them, is more or less what it was, and they needed somewhere to go. Every trade needs a market town, even this one, and they found theirs on a low sandy island in the Bahamas called New Providence, and in a shabby, half-ruined little harbor town on it called Nassau. Nassau was close to perfect for the purpose. It sat right beside the busy shipping lanes where the treasure and trade of the Americas funneled home. Its harbor was shallow enough to keep the big, deep-drafted warships of the Royal Navy out, but deep enough for the small, light ships the pirates favored. And after a hurricane and a Spanish raid had wrecked the place, there was almost no proper government left in it at all. It was, for a few short years, very nearly a town that belonged to no one, run by the men who used it. People have called it the Republic of Pirates. That is a grander name than the reality. There was no constitution, no president, no flag. But there was, genuinely, a stretch of a few years where the pirates were simply in charge of that harbor, and everyone knew it, and no one could stop it. So let's go and meet a few of the people who actually walked that beach, because you already half know them. The films borrowed their bones. Start with a man named Benjamin Hornigold. He is not a name many people know, and yet he sits near the root of almost everything. Hornigold was one of the leading pirates of Nassau in its best years, around the year 1716. He was successful, and he was also, in a strange way, cautious. For a long time he refused to attack English ships at all, only French and Spanish ones, as if he were still a privateer waiting for a war that had already ended. His crew eventually grew tired of that caution and voted him out, which is a very pirate thing to happen, because on many of these ships the captain was elected. The men chose him, and the men could unchoose him. It was rougher than any navy, and in that one narrow way, more democratic than almost anything on land. But the reason Hornigold matters most is the young man who sailed under him and learned the trade at his side, because that young man was Edward Teach, the one the whole world would come to call Blackbeard. We will spend a long, slow while with him later, because his ship is the real heart of this whole story. For now, just hold the thread. The most famous pirate who ever lived learned his craft from a careful man who did not much like breaking the rules. Then there is Charles Vane, who was everything Hornigold was not: cruel, reckless, and openly contemptuous of authority. When the king's pardon came to Nassau, Vane was the one who refused it in the most theatrical way possible, sending a burning ship at the Royal Navy in the harbor and slipping out past them in the dark. He was defiant to the very end. And the end came in the year 1721, on a gallows in Jamaica, which is where a great many of these stories quietly finish. One of the men who sailed with Vane for a time was John Rackham, though nobody called him that. They called him Calico Jack for the bright printed cotton clothes he liked to wear. Calico Jack was not one of the great pirates, if we are being honest. He took small ships mostly, close to shore, but two things attached to his name and made it last. The first is his flag, a white skull above two crossed swords on a black field. That design, more than almost any other, is the pirate flag the whole world now pictures. The second thing is the two people who sailed with him, and they are the reason his name survives at all. Because two of the fiercest members of Calico Jack's crew were women, Bonny and Mary Read. That alone was extraordinary in that world. Bonny had left a husband and taken up with Rackham. Mary Read had spent years disguised as a man, first as a soldier, then as a sailor, and was very good at both. When Rackham's ship was finally taken by a pirate hunter in the year 1720, the story that came down is that most of the men were below decks, too drunk to fight, and it was the two women who stood on deck and fought. Whether every detail of that is true, we cannot fully know, but it was written down close to the time, and it stuck. They were all put on trial in Jamaica. Calico Jack was hanged, and then his body was coated in tar and hung in an iron cage at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor as a warning. There is a small, grim place there still called Rackham's Cay. Bonny and Mary Read both escaped the noose, at least for a while, because both of them were carrying children, and the law would not hang a pregnant woman. Mary Read died in prison not long after. Anne Bonny simply vanishes from the record. Nobody truly knows what became of her, which is its own kind of ending, and it is worth saying plainly what the films do with people like these. They take the flavor and leave the fear. Anne Bonny and Mary Read become the idea that a woman could stand on that deck as an equal, which was real. Calico Jack's flag becomes the flag on every pirate ship in every scene. The elected captain, the shares of plunder voted out fairly to the crew, all of that is real, and all of it turns up softened in the movies as a kind of rough freedom. There were bigger names too. Henry Every pulled off one of the richest single robberies in the whole history of the sea, back in the year 1695, when he took a great treasure ship of the Mughal Emperor of India in the Indian Ocean. He got away with a fortune, and, almost uniquely, he was never caught. He simply disappeared with his money, which made him a legend among sailors because he was proof that the impossible thing could actually be done. And the most successful pirate of the entire age was a man almost no one has heard of today. His name was Bartholomew Roberts, and the men called him Black Bart. In just a few short years, he is said to have taken something like 400 ships. 400. Far more than Blackbeard ever did. He was disciplined and clever, and he liked fine clothes and drank tea while other men drank rum. He was killed in battle in the year 1722 off the coast of Africa, and his crew, honoring a wish he had made, weighted his body and gave it to the sea before the Navy could take it. His death is often marked as the real end of the Golden Age. After Black Bart, the great pirates were mostly gone, and there was one man sent to end all of it, who is maybe the most film-worthy of them of all, and who almost never makes the films. Woodes Rogers. He had been a privateer himself, a real one, and a famous one. Years earlier, he had sailed all the way around the world, and on a lonely island in the Pacific, his expedition had rescued a marooned Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk, who had been living alone there for more than 4 years. That rescue became the seed of the novel Robinson Crusoe. So the man who ended the pirate age is also, in a roundabout way, the reason we have that story. The Crown made Woodes Rogers the governor of the Bahamas, and in the year 1718 he sailed into Nassau to take it back. He came carrying the king's pardon in one hand and the threat of the gallows in the other. Take the pardon, give up the life, and all is forgiven. Refuse it, and be hunted. Some took it. Some, like Vane, sneered and ran. But the free harbor was finished from that day. The motto Rogers chose for the islands says the whole thing in a few words. Expelled the pirates, restored commerce. That was the end of the story, arriving by ship in a wig with a piece of paper. And it is worth being honest before we move on about the people at the very center of the films, because they work differently from the ships. You might expect that a character you love so much would turn out to be a real pirate wearing a false name. Mostly, they are not. Jack Sparrow is not a portrait of any one buccaneer who ever lived. He was very largely the invention of the actor who plays him, who famously built the walk and the slur and the sway out of an aging rock and roll musician, and not out of any figure in the histories. Hector Barbossa, Will Turner, Elizabeth Swann, Commodore Norrington, all of them are invented too. They are not real people in disguise. They are new people, built to live inside an old world, because that is what the films really borrowed. Not the individuals, but the world around them. They took the flags and the elected captains and the shared plunder, the free harbor at Nassau, the king's pardon, the whole salt-stained texture of the real age, and they built imaginary people to walk around inside it. And in one case, they did put a real pirate right on the screen, under his own true name. In the fourth film, the villain is Blackbeard himself, Edward Teach, the very man we are going to spend so much of tonight with. Except the film's Blackbeard is a sorcerer, with a sword that works magic and a ship called the Queen Anne's Revenge that breathes fire and moves its own ropes like living arms. The name is real. The man's name is real. Almost nothing else about him is. It is the same trick as the Black Pearl, simply run the other way around. With the pearl, they took a fantasy and gave it a real hull to float on. With Blackbeard, they took a real name and hung a fantasy on it. Either way, the real thread is in there if you know where to pull. So that is the cast. Those are the people whose bones the films borrowed. Now, at last, let's turn to the ships themselves, but not to any one ship yet. First, let's just stand on a dock in the quiet and look at what a ship even was, because a wooden sailing ship of this age was one of the most complicated things human beings had ever built. More complicated than almost any building. A cathedral just stands there. A ship had to do all of that, and then move, and then survive a storm while it moved. So let's take it slowly, from the bottom up, because once you can see it clearly, every ship in this story becomes easier to hold. It started with wood, enormous amounts of it. A single large ship could swallow the timber of thousands of oak trees, whole forests of them, felled and shaped and left to season for years. The spine of the ship was the keel, one long timber running the whole length of the bottom, like a backbone. Up from the keel rose the curved ribs, the frames, one after another down the length of the hull, and over the ribs went the planking, plank after plank, fitted edge to edge and sealed tight with tar and with oakum, which was old rope teased apart into fibers and hammered into every seam. That is what kept the sea on the outside, a skin of tarred oak, an inch or two of wood between a sleeping sailor and the whole cold ocean. On top of the hull rose the masts. On a full ship, there were 3 of them. At the front, the foremast. In the middle, the tallest, the mainmast. And toward the back, the mizzenmast. Each mast was not one pole, but several, joined and overlapped and rising in stages, so that a mast could stand far taller than any single tree. And holding all of that upright was the rigging, which is really 2 different things wearing one name. The first kind is the standing rigging. Those are the fixed ropes, tarred black and stiff, that brace the masts and keep them from falling. They stand still, which is where the name comes from. And then there is the running rigging, the ropes that move, that run through blocks and pulleys, that the crew hauled on to raise the sails, to turn the yards, to shorten canvas when the wind came up. A big ship carried miles of rope, actual miles of it, and a good sailor could find any single line he needed in the pitch dark by feel alone, because his life might depend on finding it fast. And then the sails. This is the part worth slowing down on, because it explains something you will need later when we talk about which ships were fast. You might imagine that a ship would want one enormous sail as big as possible to catch the most wind. It does not. It wants many sails, each one fairly small, set one above another up the mast and out along the crossbars, which are called the yards. So why not one great sail as large as the mast could hold? Why break the canvas up into a dozen smaller pieces and take on all that extra work? There is a simple, human reason for it. A small sail can be handled by a few men. A single vast sail could not be handled at all. When the wind rises and you need to take in canvas quickly, in the dark, in the cold, You want to be able to furl one sail at a time, in pieces, safely. Many small sails give the captain something priceless. They give him control. He can carry exactly as much wind as the weather allows, and not one stitch more. There are, very broadly, 2 ways to hang a sail. You can hang it across the ship on those horizontal yards so it catches wind coming from behind. Those are square sails, and a ship covered in them is called square-rigged. Square sails are magnificent with the wind at your back, out on the open ocean, running before the trade winds for weeks. Or you can hang a sail along the length of the ship, fixed at the front edge and swinging free at the back, like a door. Those are called fore and aft sails. They are worse for a following wind, but far better for sailing close to a wind coming from the side, and far handier in tight water near shore. Almost every real ship carried some mix of both, and the exact mix is a large part of what made one ship fast and nimble and another slow and steady. Down inside the hull sat the guns, rows of heavy iron cannon lashed tight, each one behind a small square door in the ship's side called a gun port. In calm and in peace, those ports stayed shut and sealed against the sea. In a fight, the crew heaved the guns forward so the black muzzles ran out through the open ports. When you hear that a ship carried 40 guns, that is what it means. 40 of those iron monsters, in rows down both sides, each one needing a crew of several men to load and fire and haul back. The number of guns was the plain measure of how dangerous a ship was, and, as we will see, it was the exact number the Royal Navy used to sort its warships into ranks. And crammed in among all of that, the guns and the barrels and the coils of rope, were the men, a great many of them in very little space. A ship might carry 100 people, or 200, sometimes more, all living together inside a wooden hull perhaps 100 feet long. They slept in hammocks slung shoulder to shoulder between the guns or on the bare boards of the deck. They ate salted meat and hard biscuit and drank water that turned green and foul in the barrel. There was no privacy and no quiet and no getting away from anyone at all. Just wet wood, close air, the endless creak and groan of the hull, and the whole cold sea a few inches away on the other side of the planks. That was home, for months at a time. Hold that picture too, because it is the plain reality underneath every romantic ship in every film. A crowd of tired, cramped, salt-soaked people, a very long way from land. And the last thing to notice is the simplest. Almost the whole ship you picture sat above the water. The tall sides, the decks, the carved and gilded stern, the towering masts. But the part that actually decided how a ship behaved was the part you could not see. The hull below the waterline. Its length, its shape, whether it was fine and knife-like or round and full. That hidden shape, more than anything painted above it, is what made a ship quick or slow. So hold all of that. The oak skin, the 3 masts, the miles of rope, standing and running, the many small sails, square and fore and aft, the rows of guns behind their little doors, and the quiet, hidden hull under the water, doing the real work. That is a ship. Now let's go and meet the most famous ship that never was. The Black Pearl is the ship at the center of the films. Black hull, black sails, and a reputation that does half its work before it ever arrives. In the story, she is the fastest ship in the Caribbean. Nigh uncatchable, one character calls her. The one ship that can outrun anything, even in the end. A ship that is not quite of this world. And the film gives her a whole life. Before she was the Black Pearl, the story says, she was an ordinary merchant ship with a rather less dignified name, the Wicked Wench. She belonged to the East India Trading Company, and her captain was a man named Jack Sparrow. The story goes that Sparrow was ordered to carry a cargo of enslaved people, and refused, and set them free instead. And for that, a cold and ruthless company man named Cutler Beckett had the ship burned to the waterline as a punishment, with Sparrow meant to go down with her. What happens next is pure folklore, and the film knows it. To save himself and his ship, Sparrow strikes a bargain with Davy Jones, the ruler of the deep. Jones raises the burned ship from the seabed, and Sparrow paints her black, hull and sails alike, and she becomes the Black Pearl. That is where her dark color comes from in the story. She is a ship that came back from the bottom of the sea, and she wears the color of the place she came back from. It is a wonderful piece of invention, and every word of it is invention. There was no wicked wench on the real ocean, no bargain, no ship raised from the dead. So the honest question is the interesting one. If the Black Pearl was never real, what was the actual thing that floated in front of the cameras? Because something did. For the first film, the one where she first appears, the Black Pearl you see is mostly a trick. Some of her was a partial set, built up on a barge, only as much ship as a given shot needed. A great deal of the rest was added later, painted in by artists and built inside computers. The whole gliding black ship, seen from far off under full sail, was very often not a physical object at all. She was an image, assembled frame by frame. But for the later films, the filmmakers actually built her, and what they built her on is one of the quiet, funny truths of this whole subject. They did not start with an old, tall ship. They started with the hull of a working vessel called the Sunset, and the Sunset was not romantic in the least. She was a long, diesel, propeller-driven ship, over 100 feet of her, and she had spent her working life out in the Gulf of Mexico servicing oil rigs, steel and engines and function, about as far from a Golden Age pirate ship as a vessel can get. They took that hull to a shipyard in Alabama, and over the better part of a year they built a pirate ship on top of it. Masts and rigging and a carved stern, decks and rails and all the rest, raised up over an oil-field workboat. And then, when she was done, they sailed her nearly 2,000 miles down to the Caribbean to film. So the most famous pirate ship in the world, the black ship you can picture right now with your eyes shut, was in her bones a modern oil rig tender in costume. There is something honest and a little bit lovely about that. She was exactly as real as she needed to be, and no more. So let's stay with the Pearl for a moment, because she lets us answer a question the films only ever wave at. What actually makes a ship fast? In the films, the answer is simple, and it is magic. She is fast because she is cursed, or blessed, or partly of the other world. But out on the real water, there is no magic, and the real answer is quieter and, honestly, more satisfying. So let's take it gently, because it is one of those things that once you see it, you cannot unsee. Here is the first thing, and it surprises almost everyone. The single biggest thing that limits how fast a normal ship can go is not the sails, and not the wind, and certainly not the paint. It is the length of the ship at the waterline. The longer the ship where it meets the water, the faster it can go. That is not a rule of thumb. It is closer to a law of the water itself. Why should length matter so much? It comes down to waves. As a ship moves, it pushes up its own wave, one at the bow and one at the stern. And a ship, in a sense, gets trapped inside its own wave. It struggles to climb out over the front of it and go faster. A longer ship makes a longer wave, and a longer wave lets the ship travel faster before it hits that wall. So a long, lean hull has a higher natural speed limit than a short, dumpy one, purely because of its length. Sailors and shipwrights knew this in their bones long before anyone had the equations. Build her long, build her lean. And then, on top of length, come two more things. The first is the shape of that hidden hull. A hull with fine, knife-like ends, narrow where it cuts the water, slips through with far less resistance than a broad, round, barrel-shaped one. The second is the rig. The amount of sail she can carry, and how well it is cut and set, and how hard her captain dares to drive her. A well-rigged ship in the hands of a bold captain will beat a badly handled one every time. So put those together, and there is your fast ship, long at the waterline, fine and lean in the hull, tall and generous in her sails. That is a fast ship on any ocean, in any century. And notice what is not on that list. Nowhere does it say the color of her paint, a black hull and a white hull, built exactly the same, sail exactly the same. The Pearl's darkness is beautiful, and it is frightening, and it does absolutely nothing for her speed. Her speed, if she were real, would live in her length and her lines and her sails, in the plain physics of wood and water, and not in the curse at all. Which brings us to the shape the Pearl actually wears, because it points at a real ship, and the real ship has a lesson of its own. With her high-carved stern and her rows of guns and her heavy, grand lines, the Pearl looks a great deal like a galleon. The galleon was the great ship of the 16th and 17th centuries, a little before the age of our pirates, though many were still afloat and still working well into it. Spain built them by the hundred, and they were the backbone of the treasure fleets, the ships that carried the silver of the Americas home across the Atlantic in yearly convoys. A big galleon was 100 to 150 feet long, with 3 or 4 masts, square sails forward, and a triangular sail or two aft, and rows of guns, 40 of them, sometimes as many as 60 on the largest. But here is the gentle irony, and it is the whole point. The real galleon was not fast. It was almost the opposite of the Pearl. A galleon was built to carry, not to race. It was a strong, deep, roomy ship, thick in the hull so it could take a cannon shot and keep floating, broad in the belly so it could hold a fortune in its hold. Even at its best, in a good wind, a galleon made perhaps 8 knots, which is a gentle jog. It traded speed away, on purpose, for strength and for space. It was a treasure wagon, not a greyhound, So the ship the Black Pearl most resembles was, in real life, one of the slower grand ships on the ocean. The film took the look of the heavy, stately treasure hauler and hung the reputation of a racehorse on it. And that is a perfectly fair thing for a film to do. It just is not how the water works. On the real sea, if you wanted to catch a fleeing pirate, you did not send a galleon. You sent something small and lean and quick, which is exactly the next ship in our story. In the first film, there are really 2 ships in the great chase, the black one, fleeing, and a smaller, sleeker one behind it, trying to keep up. That smaller ship is the Interceptor. She belongs to the Royal Navy, and she is the pride of the harbor at Port Royal. She is the ship Jack Sparrow and Will Turner steal in order to go after the Pearl, and the reason they steal her is simple. Of every ship in those waters, she is the fastest one that is not the Pearl herself, and the film is careful for once to name what she is. The Interceptor is a brig. So let's take that word slowly, because it is real, and it is exactly the right word, and it tells you a great deal. A brig is a small ship with 2 masts, and both of those masts are square-rigged, hung with those horizontal sails one above another. That is the whole definition, and it is worth holding on to because it is easy to mix up with its close cousin. A brig has square sails on both masts. Its cousin, the brigantine, carries square sails on the front mast, but fore and aft sails on the back one. They look alike from a distance, and the names have wandered over the centuries, but that is the difference. 2 masts, both square, that is a brig, and a brig was fast and handy and quick to answer the wheel, small enough to turn sharply and slip into shallow water, big enough to cross an ocean and carry a real punch. Naval brigs often mounted somewhere between 10 and 18 guns, nothing like the great warships, but plenty for the work they did. They carried messages between fleets, they scouted ahead, they patrolled the coasts, and more than almost any other kind of ship, they were sent to chase down pirates. So when the film says the Navy's fastest local ship is a brig sent to hunt a pirate, that is not a screenwriter guessing. That is precisely, historically, the job a brig was for. There was a cost to all that speed and power in a small hull. A brig needed a surprisingly large crew for her size, a lot of hands to work all that square canvas on 2 masts. That was fine for a navy, which had men to spare. It was one reason merchants, over the years, drifted toward rigs that needed fewer sailors. But for chasing and fighting, the brig was a lovely thing. Quick, nimble, and dangerous out of all proportion to her size. Now, the ship that actually played the Interceptor is real, and you can go and stand on her deck today, which you cannot do with the Pearl. Her name is the Lady Washington. She is a replica, built in the year 1989, up in the state of Washington, in a town called Aberdeen, for the 100th birthday of the state. She was built by hand, the old way, to recall a real merchant ship of the 1700s. That original Lady Washington had sailed under a captain named Robert Gray, and she has a real place in history because she was among the first ships flying the new American flag to reach the far Pacific coast of the continent. The replica was made to honor her, and the replica has led a busy second life in front of cameras. Long before she was the Interceptor, she stood in for a starship in a Star Trek film, believe it or not, and she has played tall ships in a whole string of movies and shows since. But her most famous role is the small, fast Navy ship in that first pirate film, cutting through the blue water after the Black Ship. So the Pearl was an oil rig workboat in disguise, and the Interceptor was a hand-built replica brig from the Pacific Northwest. 2 very different, real ships, dressed up as enemies, chasing each other across the warm Caribbean. And there is one more true thing hiding inside the Interceptor, and it is worth saying, because it corrects the biggest myth of all. When you picture a pirate, you picture a huge ship, towering, black, bristling with guns. But the real pirates of the Golden Age, almost all of them, most of the time, sailed small. They loved sloops and small, light craft, ships even smaller than a brig. Fast, shallow, able to dart in among the islands and reefs where the big Navy warships could not follow. A small ship could not carry as much plunder, but it could catch its prey and then run, and running was the whole trade. As we will see in a moment, even the most famous pirate of them all, once his great flagship was gone, went straight back to a little sloop, and was in some ways more dangerous for it. So the film has this exactly backward and exactly right at the same time. The huge black galleon is the fantasy. The small, fast, handy ship, the brig and the sloop, that was the reality of piracy, which is the perfect moment to walk into the one real ship at the heart of this whole story. The pirate flagship that truly existed, that we can name and date, and whose broken timbers we have actually found and touched. So let's come inward, to one man and one ship. And it starts, the way so many of these stories start, with a fairly ordinary sailor. We do not know a great deal about the early life of the man who became Blackbeard. That is normal for these people. Pirates did not tend to keep careful records of their childhoods, and the law only started writing about them once they were worth hanging. But the pieces we have point to a man named Edward Teach, sometimes written Thatch, probably born around the year 1680, most likely in the English port city of Bristol. Bristol was a great sea town, thick with ships and sailors, exactly the sort of place a boy might grow up with salt already in him. He seems to have gone to sea young and to have served during the Long War, probably aboard privateers, those legal raiders we spoke of, learning the trade of fighting at sea with a piece of paper that made it lawful. And when the war ended, and the paper stopped meaning anything, he did what so many did. He drifted to Nassau, and he went on the account. At Nassau, he fell in with Benjamin Hornigold, the careful captain we met earlier, and learned the pirates' trade at his side. Hornigold thought well enough of him to give him command of a captured sloop of his own. So by around the year 1716, Edward Teach had his own small ship and his own crew, and he was good at the work. Very good. And somewhere in here, he began to build the thing that made him immortal, which was not really his seamanship and not really his cruelty, but his image, the great black beard that gave him his name, worn long and wild, sometimes braided and tied with ribbon, and the trick that everyone remembers. Before a fight, the story says, he would push slow-burning fuses, the kind used to fire cannon, up under the brim of his hat and light them, so that his whole face loomed out of a wreath of drifting smoke, a man on fire at the edges, wrapped in a dark cloud, huge and calm and terrible. It is worth a gentle word of caution here. A great deal of what we know about Blackbeard, including the fuses in the beard, comes from a single book published a few years after his death, a lively account of the pirates written by an author whose true identity is still argued over. So some of the finer, more theatrical details may be polished or invented outright, but the core of it seems true enough. He built a reputation for terror on purpose, and he used it as a weapon. So why go to all that trouble? Why the smoke and the ribbons and the careful staging of a monster? Because a captain frightened enough might give up his ship without firing a shot, and a fight avoided is a fight you cannot lose. That, more than bloodlust, seems to have been the point. Most accounts agree he was far more interested in frightening people than in actually killing them. And then, late in the year 1717, he took the ship that would carry his name into history. On the 28th of November, out in the eastern Caribbean, roughly 100 miles off the island of Martinique, his ships fell upon a large French vessel called La Concorde. La Concorde was a French ship out of the port of Nantes, and she was a slave ship. That is a hard thing, and it belongs right here at the center of the story, not tucked away. She had crossed the whole width of the Atlantic carrying enslaved African people as cargo, bound for the plantations of the Caribbean. By the time Teach found her, her crew was in a terrible state, worn down by the long crossing, many of them sick with scurvy and with dysentery, a good number already dead. She was a big ship, but a weakened one, in no condition to fight. Teach came at her with 2 sloops and something like 150 men. He fired a couple of volleys, and the French captain, a man named Dosset, with a sick crew and no real hope, gave her up. And Edward Teach found himself in a single afternoon in command of a large ocean-crossing ship. He kept her. He took her south to the little island of Bequia in the Grenadines, and there the story turns in a way the films would never touch. The enslaved people who had been the ship's cargo were put ashore on the island. The French crew he set free, giving them one of his smaller sloops so they could sail away, a vessel they bitterly renamed the Mauvaise Rencontre, which means the bad encounter, which tells you exactly how the meeting had felt from their side. And the great French ship he kept for himself, and rebuilt into a warship, and gave a new and pointed name. He called her the Queen Anne's Revenge. He armed her heavily. Where La Concorde had carried perhaps 16 guns as a merchant ship, Teach built her up to around 40 guns. That put her, in raw firepower, in the company of a real naval warship, a 5th-rate frigate of the Royal Navy. A pirate did not usually command anything like that. Most of them, as we said, made do with small sloops. For a stretch of a few months, Edward Teach had one of the most fearsome ships in the whole Caribbean flying his flag, and he knew exactly what he had. So sit with the truth of this ship for a moment, because it is so much heavier and stranger than the film version. The Black Pearl is a beautiful lie, a ship raised by a sea god and painted with a curse. The Queen Anne's Revenge was a real, documented, ocean-crossing French slave ship taken by a sick crew's surrender off Martinique in the winter of 1717. Its human cargo left on a small island, its hull bristled with 40 stolen guns. The real story is not prettier than the film. In many ways, it is much darker. But it happened to real people, on real water, and we can still name almost all of them. Now, let's follow that ship through the one strange, violent year she flew the pirate's flag, because she did not last long. Almost none of these ships did. With the Queen Anne's Revenge under him and a handful of smaller ships around him, Edward Teach was, for a few months, something close to an admiral of the outlaws. He gathered a little fleet, a few hundred men across several vessels, and he gave himself a grand title to match: Commodore. He was, by the spring of the year 1718, near the height of his strange power, and in May of that year he did the single most audacious thing of his whole career, and he did it in broad daylight, in plain view of a city. He blockaded Charlestown. That is the city we now call Charleston, in South Carolina, and in those days it was one of the richest ports in all the American colonies. Teach simply parked his flotilla across the mouth of the harbor and stopped everything. No ship could go in or out without passing him. Over the space of about a week, he stopped something like 9 vessels, and he took prisoners off them, including some of the most prominent people in the town. He held a whole city to ransom, and here is the part that has puzzled and delighted people ever since, because the ransom he demanded was so strange. What did he want for a whole city held hostage? Gold? Silver? A king's ransom in coin? None of those things. He did not ask for a great chest of gold. He asked for medicine, a chest of drugs and medical supplies. That was his price for the hostages and the harbor. It sounds almost gentle until you think about why a pirate with 300 rough men aboard crowded ships in the tropics might be desperate for medicine, and then it becomes very human and not gentle at all. His crews were sick, some of them most likely with the diseases that spread through men in port. He needed the means to treat them. So he took a city hostage to get a medicine chest, and it worked. The colony handed over the medicines. Teach let the hostages go, most of them alive, some of them stripped of their fine clothes and sailed away north. And within weeks, the Queen Anne's Revenge was gone. On the 10th of June, in the year 1718, as Teach was bringing his fleet in through a place called Beaufort Inlet on the coast of North Carolina, the great flagship ran hard aground on a sandbar. She stuck fast, her mainmast cracked, her timbers began to work loose and break. Efforts to haul her off only drove her harder onto the bar, and there she stayed, the mightiest pirate ship in the Caribbean, undone not by a navy or a battle, but by a shallow patch of sand a few feet under the surface. So, was it an accident, or did he do it on purpose? Because that is the real question, and honest historians still argue over it. It looks at first like simple bad luck, a captain misjudging a difficult inlet. But there is a darker reading, and a lot of people find it convincing. Teach had far too many men and far too much plunder to share among them all. Losing the big ship gave him the perfect reason to break up his fleet, cram the real treasure into one small sloop, abandon most of his crew, and slip away rich and unburdened. We cannot know for certain what was in his mind on that sandbar, but the effect of the grounding suited him very well, and that has always made people wonder. Whatever the truth of it, that is what he did next. He took the treasure and a small, loyal crew aboard a little sloop. He marooned some of his men on a bare sand island and simply left them. And then he did the most surprising thing of all. He quit, or he seemed to. He sailed up to the town of Bath in North Carolina, and he took the king's pardon, the same pardon Woodes Rogers was carrying to Nassau, the one that wiped a pirate's slate clean if he swore to give up the life. Edward Teach, the terror of the coast, became on paper a free and pardoned man, living quietly in a small colonial town. For a little while at least. It did not hold. It rarely did. Within a few months, he had drifted back to the only trade he knew, taking ships again, using a favorite anchorage among the sandy islands of the Outer Banks, a place called Ocracoke, as his base. A pardoned man sliding quietly back into piracy right on the doorstep of the colonies. And that was a thing the colonies could not allow to stand. Which brings us to the last night and the fight that ended him. The governor of the neighboring colony of Virginia, a man named Alexander Spotswood, decided that Blackbeard had to be stopped, pardon or no pardon, colony or no colony. It was arguably none of his business. Another colony's coast, another colony's pardoned man. He did it anyway. He quietly hired 2 small sloops, and he manned them with sailors from the Royal Navy warships stationed nearby. and he put the whole thing under a naval officer named Robert Maynard, a lieutenant off a ship called the Pearl, a different Pearl entirely, and a nice small coincidence to end on. Maynard found Teach at Ocracoke on the night of the 21st of November in the year 1718 and waited for the light. At dawn on the 22nd, the fight began, and it was close, and it was brutal, and it was nothing like a film. Teach's sloop, the Adventure, nearly wrecked the attackers first, firing a savage broadside that killed and wounded many of Maynard's men at a stroke. Maynard hid most of his remaining crew below decks and lured Teach into boarding, thinking he had already won. When the pirates climbed across, the hidden sailors swarmed up, and the two crews fell on each other on the narrow, bloody deck. Teach and Maynard met face to face and fired at each other. They fought hand to hand, and Edward Teach was extraordinarily hard to kill. By the time he finally fell, the accounts say he had been shot perhaps 5 times with pistols and cut something like 20 times with blades, and had gone on fighting through all of it. He died there on the deck at last, in the gray morning light, in the middle of a fight he was very nearly winning. What happened after is grim, and it is also the reason we can be so sure the whole thing was real. Maynard needed proof to claim the reward on Teach's head, so he took the head. Literally, it was cut off and hung from the front of his sloop, from the bowsprit, for the sailback, and later it was set on a tall pole at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay at a spot people came to call Blackbeard's Point as a warning to any other man thinking of going on the account. That is how the most famous pirate who ever lived actually ended, not sailing off into a sunset, a severed head on a pole at the edge of a bay, and a body given to the water, and with him, in a sense, the Queen Anne's revenge passed fully out of the world. She had been aground and breaking up off Beaufort for 5 months already by the night he died. The sea took her apart, timber by timber, and the sand closed over what was left, and there she lay, forgotten, for the better part of 300 years. And then, in the autumn of the year 1996, she came back. A private research firm was searching that stretch of coast, off a place called Atlantic Beach, near the old Beaufort Inlet, looking for lost ships. And in shallow water, only about a mile offshore, and perhaps 20-odd feet down, they found a wreck, a mound of ballast stones, old iron cannon, crusted over and fused to the seabed, a great anchor. It was clearly a large, heavily armed ship of the right age, sunk in the exact place the records said Blackbeard's flagship had gone down. It took years of careful, patient work before anyone would say the name out loud with certainty. Archaeologists do not like to guess, but in the year 2011, after more than a decade of study, the state of North Carolina said it plainly. This was the Queen Anne's revenge. What they have brought up from her is astonishing, and it is still going on. More than 300,000 artifacts recovered slowly over the years and carried to a conservation lab where each piece is soaked and cleaned and coaxed back from 3 centuries under the sea. More than 20 of her cannon, some of them still loaded, still holding their shot and their charge after all that time. Anchors, lead shot by the thousands, a ship's bell, gold dust panned out of the sand grain by grain, tiny glass trade beads, the everyday hardware of a working ship, buckles and buttons and bits of pewter, the small human litter of 300 men. And it has all come up slowly, painfully slowly, and on purpose, because iron and wood that have lain 300 years in salt water will crack and crumble in the open air if you hurry them. So every single object is carried to a conservation laboratory and soaked, bath after bath, sometimes for years, drawing the salt back out of it grain by grain, before it can ever be cleaned and studied and shown. The work has gone on for the better part of 30 years now. Divers went down season after season in the murky green water off the inlet, mapping the site and lifting one crusted, shapeless lump at a time. The largest pieces of her, the great guns and the anchors, were only raised from the seabed in recent years. So the Queen Anne's Revenge has been coming home in fragments, one careful dripping piece at a time, across a stretch of years far longer than Edward Teach was ever alive. And most quietly moving of all, they found medical instruments, a set of tools for treating the sick and the wounded, a syringe still holding traces of mercury, which was the medicine of the day for certain diseases. And it is very hard, holding an object like that, not to think back to Charlestown and the strange ransom, the pirate who held a whole city hostage for a chest of medicine. Here, most likely, is some of what that ransom bought. The story and the seabed reaching out and touching each other across 300 years. So notice what has quietly happened here, because it is the whole point of the night. We began with the Black Pearl, a ship so real in our imaginations that you can picture her without trying, and yet she has no wreck, no timbers, no cannon on any seabed, because she was never anything at all. And we end with the Queen Anne's Revenge, a ship almost no one has ever pictured, and she is down there right now, off the coast of North Carolina, in the dark and the cold, her cannon and her anchors and her ballast stones lying in the sand exactly where a real man ran her aground in the year 1718. One of these ships is famous and imaginary. The other is obscure and completely, physically, touchably real. The films remembered the wrong one. There is one more ship in the films worth walking back, and it is the biggest of them all. So let's leave the pirate on the sand and turn to the navy that hunted him and to the towering warships that ruled the sea. At the very start of the first film, before the pirates, before the chase, there is a ship carrying a governor and his young daughter across the ocean to the Caribbean, a huge ship, grave and grand, rows of guns down her sides, a whole floating town of sailors. That ship is the Dauntless, and she becomes the flagship of the naval officer at the heart of the story, Commodore Norrington, the man whose whole job is to hunt pirates and hang them. The film is fond of the Dauntless. It calls her the pride of the Royal Navy and the power in these waters, and it gives her a proper name for what she is. She is a first-rate ship of the line, which is, once again, a real term and a precise one, and it opens up the whole world of how a navy actually thought about its ships. So let's take it slowly, because it is one of those tidy systems that is genuinely satisfying once you see it laid out. So how did a navy keep hundreds of ships straight in its mind? How did an admiral know, at a glance, what any one vessel could do in a fight? The Royal Navy, in this age, sorted its warships into 6 ranks. They called them rates. And the thing that decided a ship's rate was beautifully simple. It was the number of guns she carried. That was it. Count the guns, and you knew her rate. And from her rate, you knew almost everything else about her, her size, her crew, her job, her place in a battle. At the very top sat the first rate, 100 guns or more, 3 whole decks of them, stacked one above another down each side of the ship. A crew of around 850 men, living together inside one wooden hull. 2,000 tons and more of oak and iron. A first rate was not really a ship in the way a small boat is a ship. It was a floating fortress, a fortified town that moved. There were never very many of them, because they cost a fortune to build and a fortune to keep manned, and they were saved for the most important role of all, which we will come to in a moment. Just below her came the second rate, with around 90 guns, also on 3 decks, a crew nearer 750. Grand ships, though sailors grumbled that they handled poorly, heavy and slow to answer. Then the third rate, and this is the one that really mattered because it was the workhorse of the whole Navy. Somewhere between 64 and 80 guns on 2 decks, with the 74-gun version being so perfectly balanced, so exactly the right mix of firepower and speed and cost that navies built them by the hundred. If you picture the backbone of a fighting fleet in this age, you are picturing rows of 2-decked 74s. Below those came the fourth rate, 50 to 60 guns, on the edge of being useful in a great battle and slowly falling out of that role as ships grew larger. And then, below the fourth rate, we cross an important line and come to the ships that were not built to stand in a battle at all. The fifth rate and the sixth rate. The frigates. A fifth-rate frigate carried something like 32 to 40 guns, all on a single deck, with a crew of around 300. And a frigate was a different kind of animal entirely. She was fast, she was lean, she was the Navy's scout and messenger and hunter, sent ranging out ahead of the fleet, sent to chase down smaller ships, sent to patrol lonely coasts. Sailors loved the frigates. They were the glamour ships, where a young captain could win a reputation and prize money, far from the slow, grinding weight of the great fleets. And you might notice a number there, around 40 guns, because that is roughly what Blackbeard put aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. So when we say his flagship had the firepower of a small naval frigate, that is exactly what we mean. A pirate had, for a few months, armed himself to something near the level of one of the king's own fifth-rate warships. That is why he could blockade a city and get away with it. Now, here is the phrase at the center of all this, the one attached to the Dauntless, ship of the line. Where does it come from? It comes from the way these great fleets actually fought. When two fleets met, they did not swirl about in a grand melee, the way films love to show. They formed up, each fleet, into a single long line, one ship behind another, sometimes for miles. And the two lines would sail slowly along beside each other, close enough to shout across, and pour their broadsides into one another, gun deck answering gun deck, until one line broke. It was less like a duel, and more like two long walls of cannon grinding past each other in the smoke. And to stand in that line, to take that kind of punishment and keep firing, a ship had to be strong enough and heavily gunned enough to belong there. A ship big enough for the job, first rate through roughly fourth rate, was called, for that reason, a ship of the line. A ship fit to stand in the line of battle. The frigates and the little ships were not. They were too lightly built. They would be smashed. So they stayed out of the line and did the other work, the scouting and the chasing. The Dauntless, as a first-rate ship of the line, is therefore the film saying, in proper technical language, that she is the mightiest class of warship afloat, which she is, and which is also quietly the joke. Because a first-rate ship of the line was magnificent, and it was also slow, ponderous, a vast heavy hull, deep in the water, made to stand and fight, not to sprint. The very thing that made her a fortress made her a poor chaser. She could no more catch a nimble little pirate sloop in the shallows than a castle could chase a fox, and that is exactly why, when a real colony actually needed to kill a real pirate, when Virginia went after Blackbeard, they did not send a first-rate. They could not have used one if they had it. They sent two small, shallow, hired sloops that could follow him in among the sandbars. The whole overwhelming might of the Dauntless in the real business of pirate hunting would have been almost useless. It was always the small ships that did the killing. There is one real first-rate you can still go and see, and she makes all of this solid, though she comes a little after our pirates. Her name is HMS Victory. She was the flagship of Admiral Nelson at the Great Battle of Trafalgar in the year 1805, and she is preserved to this day in a dry dock in Portsmouth in England, where you can walk her decks. If you ever want to feel the truth of what a first-rate was, of what the Dauntless was pretending to be, you can stand under her masts and feel it. 100 guns and a crew of hundreds, a wooden world built to hold the line. So that is the last of the great ships accounted for. The black one, the fast little one, the pirate flagship, and the towering man-of-war, which leaves only the strangest ship of all, the one that was never even meant to be real. Come inward one more time, to the ghost. In the second and third films, the counterpart to the Black Pearl, is a ship out of nightmare. The Flying Dutchman, the vessel of Davy Jones, crewed by drowned men slowly turning into the sea itself, barnacled and coral-crusted, part flesh and part hull. She can sail beneath the waves. She ferries the souls of those who die at sea. She is the supernatural engine of the whole later story, and she is, of all the ships we have talked about, the one with the least to walk back to, because she was folklore long before she was a film. The Flying Dutchman is one of the oldest ghost stories of the sea, the tale of a ship condemned never to reach port, doomed to sail on forever, appearing to other vessels out of the storm as an omen of bad luck. The legend grew up in the world of the old Dutch trading empire, the 17th and 18th century ships beating around the stormy Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa, and for centuries afterward, sober sailors, even naval officers, wrote down accounts of seeing a strange old sailing ship glowing on the horizon where no ship should be. We should be careful and honest here. That is a legend. It is a beautiful and enduring one, and there are real things underneath it. Tricks of light on cold seas that can lift the image of a distant ship up into the air and make it shimmer and hang above the water. But the Flying Dutchman herself is folklore, not history, and the films took her exactly as folklore. So there is no real vessel to point at, no timber, no wreck, no name in a ledger. When you see the Dutchman rise dripping out of the sea in the films, you are watching something built entirely inside computers. No ship ever played her. She is a ghost, even in the making of the movie. But here is a quiet and true thing to end the ships on, because there is one real vessel tangled up in these films that met an end as ghostly as any legend. In the second film, there is an ordinary merchant ship called the Edinburgh Trader. The ship that played her was real, and she was famous in her own right. She was a full-sized replica of HMS Bounty, the ship from the most famous mutiny in naval history, and this replica had been built by hand back in the year 1960 in Nova Scotia for an earlier film about that mutiny. For over 50 years, she really sailed the world, a working tall ship and a movie ship both. And in the autumn of the year 2012, that Bounty was caught at sea in a great hurricane, the storm people called Sandy, off the coast of North Carolina. The same waters, near enough, where Blackbeard's flagship lies in the sand. And she went down. She sank in the storm, and not everyone aboard came home. A real tall ship, one that had stood in for pirate ships and mutiny ships on the screen, lost with lives in a hurricane off the Carolina coast, in our own lifetimes. If you were looking for a real ghost ship in all of this, a real vessel swallowed by the sea, that is the closest you will find. And she was as real as the legend is not. So that is all of them. The 5 ships you thought you knew. Each one walked back out of the film and set down in the real water it came from. And it is worth pausing here, before we begin the long, slow drift back toward sleep, because there is a question underneath all of this that is worth turning over gently in the dark. Why do we remember it the way we do? Why the black ship and not the wreck in the sand? Why the romance when the truth was so much harder? Start with how quickly the real thing ended. The Golden Age of Piracy feels in the films like a whole world, a settled way of life. It was not. It was a flash. The great years, the Nassau years, the years of Blackbeard and Vane and Rackham and Roberts lasted barely a decade. Blackbeard died in the year 1718. Calico Jack was hanged in 1720. Charles Vane went to the gallows in 1721. Black Bart, the most successful of them all, was killed in 1722. In the space of 4 or 5 years, nearly all of them were gone. The pardons, the navy, the new governor, and the rope closed the window almost as fast as the end of the war had opened it. By the late 1720s, it was essentially over. So the age itself was tiny. Almost everything that made it enormous came afterward, and came from storytellers. It was the writers who built the pirate we picture now, Slowly, across 200 years, a famous novel about buried treasure and a one-legged sea cook, written more than a century and a half after Blackbeard died, a pantomime villain with a hook for a hand, dreamed up for a children's play about a boy who would not grow up, a theme park ride with its own little sailing ships gliding through the dark, and then, at last, the films, which gathered up all of that and poured it into one black-sailed shape. There is a lovely small loop hidden in there, by the way. The name the films gave to the black pearl in her innocent early life, the Wicked Wench, was borrowed straight from that theme park ride, where a little pirate ship of that name has floated for well over 50 years. So the fictional ship was named after another fiction, a story about a story about a story, and somewhere far underneath all of it, a real French slave ship on the seabed off North Carolina. That is how myths are built. Layer on gentle layer, each one a little further from the water where it started. And here is the honest heart of it. The myth kept some things and quietly dropped others. It kept the adventure, the freedom, the black flags, the fast ships, the treasure. And it let go of the rest. It let go of the disease that filled the ransom chest at Charlestown. It let go of the fact that the most famous pirate ship of all had been a slave ship, and that its captain had trafficked in human beings as cargo. It let go of how young most of these men were, and how poor, and how briefly they lived. A pirate's career, on average, was measured in a year or two, and it ended, more often than not, by drowning or by hanging. It was not a long golden life. It was a short, hard, frightening one, and it usually ended badly. But it would not be fair or true to say the myth is simply a lie, because it kept some real things too, and they are the things that still move us. The pirate ships really did elect their captains and vote out the ones they disliked, in an age when almost no one on land chose their masters. They really did share their plunder by agreed rules, often more fairly than any merchant or navy crew of the time. There really were women on those decks who fought as equals, and the small, fast, free ship, darting where the great warships could not follow, that was real too. The romance is selective, but it is not empty. It kept some of the best of it, along with all of the shine. So we are left with a strange and gentle truth. The most famous ship in the world is one that never existed, and the ship that actually carried the most famous pirate lies quietly on a seabed almost no one visits. The imaginary one gets the fame. The real one gets the fish and the sand, and yet the real one is the only one you could ever reach out and touch if you had the boat and the light and the will to go down and find it, which, in the end, is a comforting kind of thought to fall asleep on. The truth is still down there. It does not need to be famous to be real. So let's come back down now. Let's gather the ships one last time, gently, and let each one go, and drift slowly back toward the room and the bed and the dark. Let the black ship go first, since she was never really there to begin with. The black pearl, nigh uncatchable, painted with a curse. Remember what she truly was. A working oil rig ship called the Sunset, dressed in masts and a carved stern in a shipyard in Alabama, and sailed south to play a ghost. And remember the quiet, true thing she taught us, that a ship's speed was never in her color. It was in her length at the waterline, and the fine shape of her hidden hull, and the reach of her sails. Plain wood and water and wind. No curse required. Let her sail off into the dark where she came from, which is your own imagination, and let her go. Let the little fast ship go next. The Interceptor, the Navy brig, the fastest thing in the harbor that was not the Pearl. Remember that she is real, and that of all these ships, she is the one you could actually go and find. The Lady Washington, built by hand for a state's birthday, 2 masts and square sails, still out there sailing, still taking people out onto the water. A real brig, the exact kind of small, quick ship the Navy truly used to hunt pirates. You could stand on her deck one day if you liked. Hold that, then let her go too. Let the pirate flagship go. The Queen Anne's Revenge, 40 guns, the terror of a coast for one short, violent year. Remember what she really was before that, a French ship called La Concorde, and remember where she is now, off Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina, in shallow cold water, her cannon and her anchors and her ballast stones lying in the sand where a real man ran her aground in the year 1718. She is down there tonight in the dark, under the same sea you carry a little of inside you. Let her rest there, and let her go. Let the great warship go. The Dauntless, the pride of the Navy, the first-rate ship of the line, 100 guns and a crew of hundreds, a fortress that floated. Remember her real sister, HMS Victory, standing in her dry dock in Portsmouth to this very night, dark and quiet, her masts bare, waiting for morning and the people who will come to walk her decks. Let the great ship stand there in the dark, holding her line against nothing at all, and let her go, and let the ghost go last, since she was only ever a story, the Flying Dutchman, doomed never to come home. There is nothing to lay to rest, because there was never anything there, only an old fear of the sea, and a trick of cold light on a far horizon, and a shape that computers drew. Let the legend drift off where legends live, out past the edge of what is real, and let it go. So the ships are all let go now, the real ones and the invented ones, drifting off into the dark in their different directions, and the people go with them. That is the last and quietest part of the descent, and it is worth taking slowly. Think of how far back all of this really is. Edward Teach has been dead for more than 300 years. So has Benjamin Hornigold, who taught him. So has Charles Vane, and Calico Jack, and the 2 women who fought on his deck, and Bartholomew Roberts who took 400 ships, and Woodes Rogers who came to end it all with a pardon in his hand. Every single person in this story, the pirates and the sailors and the governors and the frightened people of Charlestown, all of them lived their whole lives and died and were buried or given to the sea 3 centuries ago. They are as gone can be. And does any of it need you to remember it? Does the story need you awake, holding the dates, keeping the names in order? It does not. Not one bit of it. It happened whether anyone remembers it or not, and it is finished, and it is safe now, the way only the long ago is safe. There is nothing left in it that can reach you. It is all just history now, soft and settled, like sand closing over an old wreck. What is left, when the ships and the people have all drifted off, is the thing that was underneath the whole story from the beginning. The sea itself, the same warm Caribbean water the pirates sailed, the same gray Atlantic swell that broke over the Queen Anne's Revenge on her sandbar, the same cold ocean off the Cape where sailors thought they saw the ghost ship glowing. It is all one sea, and it is all still there, moving tonight exactly as it moved then, rising and falling in the dark, indifferent and calm and old beyond anything. And here is the gentle thread that ties you to all of it, lying where you are. You carry a little of that same sea inside you, the salt in your blood, the fluid moving quietly through you, keeping time. Your breath is rising and falling right now in a slow rhythm, in and out, like a swell rolling in from far away and sliding back out again. The same wind that filled those sails is the air moving softly in and out of you now. You are made, in part, of the very things this whole story floated on: water and salt and slow rhythm, and a little warmth held against the cold. So come the rest of the way down now, away from the ships, away from the sea, back to the room where you actually are, back to the bed, back to the weight of your own body, warm and still under the covers, held up by the mattress, held down by nothing at all. There is no watch to stand tonight, no sail to shorten, no inlet to find in the dark, no line to haul. The only thing you are steering, right now, is your own slow breathing, and even that can look after itself. Feel how still it is here. No swell, no wind, no cold. Just the quiet dark of your own room, and the soft edges of everything, and the day letting go of you at last. The way the sea lets go of a ship that finally comes into harbor after a long crossing. And while you lie here, safe and warm and going nowhere, it is a soft thing to think about where the real ships are, right now, tonight, in the same dark that is filling your room. Because they are all still out there, every one of the real ones, resting the way you are about to. The Lady Washington is at a dock somewhere on the Pacific coast, most likely, her 2 masts bare against the night sky, her square sails furled and tied, her ropes still. The little brig that played the fast Navy ship. She is tied up quietly at a pier, rising and falling a few inches on the harbor swell, her lines creaking now and then, waiting for morning and for the people who will come to sail her. She is not chasing anything tonight. She is just floating and resting in the dark. The Queen Anne's Revenge is where she has been for 300 years, off Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina, under maybe 20 feet of cold Atlantic water. Her cannon lie half buried in the sand, crusted and quiet. Her great anchor rests on its side. The fish move over her in the dark, the way they have every night for 3 centuries, and the current pushes gently through the ballast stones, and she does not stir. The most feared pirate ship in the Caribbean, lying softer now than she ever lay in life, at rest and going nowhere and needing nothing, far across the ocean, in a dry dock in Portsmouth, HMS Victory stands in the dark, the real first-rate, the true version of the towering warship from the film. 100 guns, silent, her 3 great masts rising into the night above the sleeping dockyard. No crew aboard now, no watch on deck, only the old timbers ticking and settling as the temperature drops, the way old wood does. She has held her line. She is done with the sea. She simply stands there in the quiet, waiting for the light and the first visitors of the day. And somewhere off that same Carolina coast where the pirate flagship lies, deep down in the cold and the dark, the Bounty rests too, the tall ship the storm took, down where the light does not reach, quiet at last, after all her sailing and all her rolls. Even she is only resting now. The sea holds her the way it holds all of them, gently, without judgment, without hurry. So there they all are, the little brig at her dock, the pirate wreck in the sand, the great warship in her dock across the sea, the lost ship deep in the dark water, all of them still, all of them resting, all of them perfectly fine without a single person watching over them tonight. The sea keeps them. It always has. It does not need any help from you. And the imaginary ships are resting too, in their way. The Black Pearl is furled up somewhere in the back of your mind, her black sails put away. The Flying Dutchman has sunk back into the old story she came from. They only ever sailed when someone was picturing them, and you are about to stop picturing anything at all, and that is exactly as it should be. Let them lie quiet in there, in the dark behind your eyes, alongside all the real ones. So here is the last gift of the night, and it is the same one from the very beginning, offered again now that the story is done. You do not have to remember any of it. Not one ship, not one name, not a single date. If the whole thing has already slipped away from you, if the pirate's name is gone and the ship's name is gone, and all that is left is a warm blur of sea and sail and dark water, then it has worked exactly as it was meant to. That is not forgetting. That is letting go, which is a different and a kinder thing. The names were never yours to carry. They belonged to the people who lived them 300 years ago, and those people set them down long ago, and so can you. You do not have to hold the difference between the real ships and the invented ones. You do not have to keep the black ship on one side and the wreck on the other. Let them all run together now, the true and the imagined, the galleon and the brig and the ghost, into one soft picture of ships on a dark sea, and then let even that go soft at the edges, and then let it go, because none of it needs you. That is the quiet, comforting truth to carry down into sleep. The story is finished, and it has been finished for centuries, and it is not waiting on you for anything at all. It does not need you to remember it to have happened. It does not need you awake to stay true. It asks nothing of you. It never did, and it will all still be here in the morning, every bit of it. The Queen Anne's Revenge will still be lying in the sand off Beaufort Inlet when the sun comes up, exactly as she has for 300 years, and she will not have missed you. The Lady Washington will still be tied at her dock, and someone will walk down to her in the morning light and cast off her lines, and she will go out onto the water again. HMS Victory will still be standing in her dry dock across the ocean, and the doors will open, and people will come to walk her decks and look up at her masts. All of it, waiting, patient, going nowhere, perfectly fine without you. And the sea that carried every one of them will still be moving in the morning too, the way it is moving right now, rising and falling in the dark, salt and slow and old. It was here long before any of these ships, and it will be here long after the last of them is gone, and it holds all of them the same way, gently, without hurry, without needing a thing from anyone. So there is nothing left for you to do, nothing to steer, nothing to watch, nothing to hold. The ships are all at rest. The people are all long at peace. The story is safely told and safely over. And you are here in a warm, still room, a very long way from any cold sea, with nothing at all required of you now but to let the day finish and slip under. So let that settle. Let your body get heavy. Feel the weight of it against the mattress, the way a ship settles at last into calm water, and let the last of the day drain out of you and away. Your breathing is already slower than when we began. Let it slow a little more, in and out, like a swell coming in from far away and sliding back out again. That is the only tide you need to mind tonight, and it will keep itself. There is no watch to stand. There is no storm coming. There is no inlet to find in the dark, no line to haul, no sail to shorten, no name to remember. There is only this, a warm bed, a quiet room, the soft dark, and a slow rising and falling that will carry you the rest of the way on its own, if you simply let it. So just rest now. Let the ships sail off wherever ships go when no one is watching them anymore. Let the sea keep them, the real ones and the imagined ones both. Let the whole long story drift off over the dark horizon, quiet and complete, and needing nothing. And let yourself drift too, down and down, soft and slow, into the deep, still water of sleep, where there are no ships at all, and nothing to catch, and nowhere to be. The sea is calm tonight. The harbor light is burning low and steady far off across the dark water. Everything that ever sailed is safely at anchor, and so are you. So just breathe, and let it all go dark now, slowly, gently, all the way down. Good night.